the Reuters Institute. We're housed right here in Oxford. We believe very, very strongly in the principles of journalism. That's what we speak to. That's what we work for every day. And we're a small but very dedicated team that really works around some of those goals. My thanks first to Chris for persevering through the months of COVID where it didn't seem like this would happen, and then some rushed calls across time zones where we finally did make it happen. And I'm very glad for that to have taken place. I would challenge the idea that journalists have not been part of revealing or exposing corrupt practices. In fact, I would stick my neck out without any data to say that every time there has been corruption at an institutional level, at an individual level, or at a larger organizational level, it has been carried on the shoulders of a journalist or a journalistic organization that has done that quite bravely, frankly, increasingly so in the political environment that many of us live in for many of the countries that we come from. I would also add that I am personally fascinated by the idea of public integrity, because I think so much of what a journalist can do and so much of the bravery that a journalist absorbs is from the community itself. When public integrity is compromised for countries, it puts a journalist first and foremost at risk for doing their job and doing their job honestly. I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation. We're going to get some great input as well. And I am conscious of wanting to get as much opinion from the room, because that's the best part of not seeing people just neck down, isn't it? It's great to have folks here in person and really pick up from the chemistry of the room as well. So let me, without further ado, introduce our guest for today. Many pictures of her, which she doesn't seem to enjoy, but Jane Bradley is investigative reporter for the New York Times in London. She has been shortlisted for Pulitzers, the Orwell Prize. A lot of her work has been focusing on crime, corruption, really revealing much of that. And interestingly, Jane did so much work during the COVID period, I think, which showed up a lot of the flaws that exist in systems I want to say this sort of tricky way that corruption seeps into every part of the systems that we live in today. So lots to talk to you about, Jane. Thank you very much for joining in. Let me start with perhaps a framework sort of question. What do you see as the importance of journalists in revealing and taking on corrupt practices?
I think the main role of journalists in that is simply to tell people it's happening, right? That's the first step. We have to put on public record that there is this problem with corruption, with dirty money, to expose it so that those in power can't just turn around, shrug their shoulders and say, well, we didn't do anything about it because we didn't know about it. So I think first and foremost, that is a journalist's job, to expose it, to put on public record that this is a problem. And I think that's really central to holding governments, holding big corporations to account, just simply having that transparency, that accountability, that the public know about whatever dodgy business, whatever wrongdoing has been happening. And I think investigative journalists in particular have an important role to play in that. And one thing we kind of have the luxury of doing that daily news journalists who are constantly under the cosh and having to move from story to story don't always have is the ability to, the resources to follow up, right? And I think that's a really important part of journalism. It's not enough these days, especially, I don't know if you guys have been following the British media, British government, scandal after scandal, the sleaze scandals, the corruption scandals. Honestly, as a journalist, it's kind of a frustrating time because you publish a story that you think is really damning and is going to lead some change. And then there's another bloody scandal and we've moved on. So all politicians and corporations have to do is keep quiet for a bit, for the most part. And then the news cycle just moves on. And so it's become increasingly hard for journalists to get impact from these stories revealing corruption and wrongdoing. And I think that's where the follow-on is really important. So often the biggest stories, the biggest investigations that have changed something haven't just been someone publishing one story, it's been a series. And more often than not, the only ones that make an impact when journalists kind of work together, where other news outlets will pick up an original story, do their own reporting, move the story on. And then I think you've got those in power saying, okay, we're going to have to do something about this because everyone's on our back and it's not going away.
No, absolutely. And aside from the UK, I think it's so timely because of the events over the weekend in Brazil. It's an indication of how corruption can start leaning so hard into positions of organization or authority and get completely compromised. I'm interested, though, in a little bit of your journey, especially for folks joining in. What led you down the investigative job? I'm sure you don't wake up one morning and say, right, I'm going to switch to investigative journalism now. That's what I'm going to do because things seem boring. What led you to it?
No, I started off, I mean, I was really annoying and precocious, and knew I wanted to be a journalist from about 12 years old, but I wanted to be a music journalist because I wanted to go to gigs and like get
close enough.
Yeah, close enough. Because that's what I was interested in. And one day I was in a sociology class at A-level at my college, and we were shown this panorama documentary about institutional racism in the Met Police. And this journalist had gone undercover at the Met Police, the biggest police force in the UK, and had basically exposed this horrendous institutional racism in there. And it led to these huge reforms. I mean, I'm not sitting here and saying everything's been fixed and there's no racism in the police right now, but it was an insight for me into how powerful journalism can be and how it can change things that are wrong. And I guess I've always just been angry at wrongdoing, at injustice. And I think that anger can be a good thing if you're a journalist. You can kind of use it to try and expose the thing that you think is wrong and try and do some, you know, it might be a tiny change for one family or something rather than a big systemic change. But really it was that documentary when I was 16, 17, that made me think I want to be an investigative journalist. And since then, I've spent my whole career pissing off government press offices, big corporations, getting legal letters rather than invites to nice, fancy events. So every now and then, when I see my colleagues opposite me getting these lovely invites to these glamorous awards dues or things, I'm like, have I picked the right profession? So I think you've got to be a bit of a disruptor and the right type of trouble causer, and very stubborn for investigative journalism to work for you.
Rage against the machine, right?
Exactly.
In our previous chats, you did mention that you've actually seen, and this is interesting for me, a change in audiences and a change in audience engagement, particularly post-COVID and post-Ukraine, towards the idea of corruption. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, when I was kind of first starting out in journalism, you know, I didn't have any speciality in following the money or corruption stuff at all, and like a lot of the room here, it just seemed to me that this was a really underreported issue, and a lot of journalists just weren't good at following the money, at reading numbers, even on a kind of basic level. And when I was first pitching these stories, I was at the BBC at the time, then a lot of the answers would be, or the response would be from editors would just be, one, it's quite a boring story. Do people care about money? Like, it's just finance. Where are the human stories? Where are like the victims? Where's the like, I think they just saw a boring number story basically. And it was really hard when I was making a pitch. I'd always have to go these extra 10 miles to kind of explain to editors why this mattered, that there was a victim in this, just because there wasn't, you know, an immediate victim firsthand. If you follow the money through, you would see the harm it was doing. So it was really a tough slog to get these corruption, these financial stories over the commissioning bar. And then I think I noticed, like you said, a real change, firstly, when the COVID pandemic hit, because in the UK and I know elsewhere in the world, suddenly you had this, you could see this real world impact on, in the UK, we had this big government corruption scandal with PPE, protection equipment and procurement, and also testing on a lesser level. And what you saw were all these firms kind of profiteering and seeing, okay, here's an opportunity for me to get rich. I can win these £1 million government contracts. And it quickly became apparent, like, you know, these firms, me and my colleagues did a big analysis of all the firms that had been awarded these contracts and found that, you know, a vast majority had no experience in the health industry or in protective equipment. Some of them had been set up like a week before they were awarded a contract. And then we learned about the existence of the VIP lane. So companies, directors with no experience in the field, winning these huge contracts because they knew someone, Matt Hancock or someone like that. And what it showed, and they were producing these gowns that didn't work and this protective equipment that didn't work. So it showed a kind of in really stark detail the link between corrupt or questionable financial decisions, procurement decisions, and people's lives, effectively. And suddenly people got it, and it was a lot easier to get these stories about profiteering, about corruption over the bar. And I think that increased even further following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because then the whole world responded by what? By clamping down on money, on sanctioning whoever, finally sanctioning in the UK's case, big Russian oligarchs and companies that for years had avoided. And what message it sent was that, okay, there is, again, this direct correlation between money and harm. In this case, people in Ukraine and the war and funding the Kremlin war machine. And since then, there's just been more and more of an understanding of why corruption and why money stories matters. And I think the public get it more and editors get it more from a journalistic point of view.
You know, I'm intrigued by that because just yesterday, Reuters released sort of trends and predictions for the year going ahead. And one of the takeaways there from amongst the news leaders that we spoke to was that 70% were worried about news avoidance going into this year. And the two issues that they were mostly worried about, where they felt the audience was flagging and really couldn't take anymore, was exactly this: COVID and Ukraine. Perhaps the optimist in me would wonder whether the compass is moving towards corrupt practices under both these categories. But compare that, because I'd love to hear your experience. The Russian story, for example, is not something you sort of started reporting on now. You've been working on this since 2015. Did you see a sea change in how people were responding to your stories when you released them then versus now?
Oh, 100%. Back in 2015, when we released our investigation into the suspected Russian assassinations on British soil, I mean, firstly, I was at BuzzFeed, so there was a lot of people going, oh, it's just the cat people. They don't really know what they're talking about. They're not serious investigative journalists. Let's just ignore them. But also, other than the poisoning of Alexander Perepelichny, there haven't been many proven documented cases of Russian or attempted Russian assassinations on UK soil. So at the time, it kind of felt quite fringe and not everyone was talking about it. We spent 2 years on this investigation. We published it, and almost nobody picked it up. Like none of the media picked it up, no politicians picked it up, nothing. And it was a bit devastating, to be honest. I would put a lot of time and effort into this. And that's a risk of pursuing an investigation that's not already on the news agenda. And then suddenly everything changed when with the attempted poisoning of Sergei Skripal in Salisbury back in 2018, I think it was. And suddenly, it was such a bad job and the evidence was so clearly there that there was no denying it was Russia. And then suddenly there was a sea change and thinking, oh, okay, maybe we should take the threat from Russia seriously. And before then, I mean, even up till, to be honest, the war, you still had all these MPs on both sides, but particularly the Conservatives, taking millions, hundreds of thousands from Russian oligarchs, from Kremlin officials, Putin's right-hand men. You had people in the House of Lords with appointments on huge Russian corporations. So the flow of money from Russia to the UK was huge, and no one wanted to kind of put a stop to that. And it was only with such a kind of brazen attack on British soil, with clear evidence, that the tide kind of changed, and people suddenly, we got shortlisted for Pulitzer. Everyone wanted us on every TV station. It was like, oh, maybe those cat people were actually onto something a couple of years ago. But there has been a change. And I think it's interesting, like you said, people are getting kind of weary of that. And I think there really is an element to that. And when people pitch me COVID stories now, I'm kind of like, it's been done. People are kind of bored of it. And I think you're right. It moves on to covering it as just like a breaking news story, like the events of what's happening. And I think now actually it's more important than ever that in particular investigators and investigative journalists don't give up and move away the public scrutiny on Russia and on the money flows, particularly to the West, because I think that's what a lot of people are counting on. The media's tired, the public's tired. So I think there's a higher bar for what stories are interesting now. And I think the corruption side of things is particularly going to be a big issue, the money, the corruption over the next year.
Yeah. It's a good segue to ask you about the idea of public integrity as well as a journalist, because as you said, you put your heart and soul into the story, you place it into the world, and then frankly, it's on to your universe of, readers or viewers and where they take it from. How does one cross that barrier from having created this story or at least worked on this story and then sort of igniting it amongst public consciousness?
It's a really good question. It's one we think about a lot. I think in journalism, particularly investigative journalism, there's always this kind of tension between straight up reporting something and campaigning, right? And there's different schools of thought. Journalists can debate for ages on what we should be doing. Personally, I was trained at the BBC. I know it's the New York Times. I'm of the school that we should be as balanced, as impartial as possible, and we should simply be reporting what's happening and then leaving it to the campaigners, the politicians to then act on it. Our job is to tell people what's happening, not to try and lobby for something to happen in response. However, having said that, what I think we can do, and what I do a lot of stories, is making sure our reporting is read by the right people who can influence change. So when I published a story a couple of months ago looking at basically racial inequalities in the UK criminal justice system, particularly looking at this law called joint enterprise used in a lot of gang prosecutions. We published a story, but what I did is made sure the right politicians in Parliament knew that it had been published, knew what we hadn't been able to get, what we were trying to get, some of the data the prosecution service refused to give us or we weren't able to get. And they then were able to ask questions in Parliament and get some answers from government that we weren't able to do. And also it means, it's then reported in Parliament. Instead in Parliament, you're protected under parliamentary privilege. So legally, the rest of the media can then pick it up if they want to, and it's much easier to report a story, as well as it just gaining a wider audience. And same with things with Transparency International, Global Witness. I often talk to them about stories and they will ask, we might talk on background about stuff we hadn't been able to report, but that they think is important with some legislation or bill pushing forward and things like that. So for me, I think our job is to report what's happened, but then pass it on to the people and make sure it's got to the right people who can influence change and bring about change.
You did talk about the Russian oligarchs, but is there a story that comes to mind where it was a surprising response, either in terms of, the sea of support that you got or that it went another way? Does anything stand out in the last few years?
Yeah, so obviously, like all last year, we spent a whole year working on this big criminal justice story that we put our heart and soul into. And then the Queen sadly passes. So then everyone wants a royal story. And my editors are all desperate for the royal story. I mean, the Americans are obsessed with the royal family anyway. Even before.
Gee, I wonder why.
Even before anything else happened.
Netflix, anyone?
So they just wanted a quick turnaround story, just something on the royal family, anything. It's that kind of pitch as an investigative journalist or request you kind of dread getting. So it's like, just give me a story in 24 hours and make it like scoopy and new, but you've only got 24 hours. But you do have to do this story as well as a longer burn. So I did this story. It wasn't a great scoop or great investigation, but basically I did a deep dive looking at how now King Charles has kind of built this $1 billion empire out of the duchies and all the royal estate and stuff, particularly against the backdrop of austerity in the UK. So all I did was kind of, a lot of other newsrooms have kind of looked at, individual accounts, stuff like that, but I just looked at all the accounts out there and pulled it together into kind of this in-depth analysis, looking at basically the pot of money that the royal family had and how they built it up. And it honestly wasn't, I don't think, a great piece of journalism, but it was the most read by far of any story I've done. It was nearly 2 million viewers. And I was so annoyed because I knew that our criminal justice story, not on the news agenda, would get a quarter of that. But I think what it showed was at the time we published it, timing is a big thing, right? It was already on the news agenda. So if you've got, and this isn't a corruption story, I want to make this clear, this is just a following the money story. But if you've got a story like that, that taps into something already on the news agenda, you've automatically got a huge audience for it because people are just interested at the time. And secondly, we were offering something different that the rest of the media, British and otherwise, wasn't doing, because it was soon after the Queen's death, maybe a few days after, and all of the coverage was basically, you know, incredibly positive and almost fawning. And the New York Times had a lot of incredibly positive coverage as well. But this story, I mean, honestly, it was very light amount of scrutiny, very light critical look, basically like a glowing PR release compared to what I normally do, but it was slightly critical. And I think there was a lot of, you know, people who don't believe in the monarchy who wanted that. And didn't want this kind of rose-tinted view in it all and wanted a bit of critical thinking. So it did really well for us, unfortunately, and I'll probably have to do more royal stories, but not about Harry and Meghan, thank God. But I think that's just the power, even as an investigative journalist, you know, we do these long-form stories, these long-term stories, but there is also value in doing those quick turnaround stories on something that's already in the news, that's maybe offering a deeper reporting or a different take than what's already out there.
You know, in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of pushback against the UK government for their climate decisions, that, you know, they're taking steps back.
Didn't Rishi just fly to Leeds?
He did, absolutely. It was the fastest way, apparently. Trains don't exist. What was funny, though, was that I saw on Twitter, a climate reporter write a tweet saying, what I loved about the Harry and Meghan episode was, and then inserted his climate story. So maybe there's maybe there's a tip there for all of us on stuff that we work on and we want to get the attention that we think our story deserves. Financial corruption reporting, Jane, that's, you know, it's a tricky one because it's so onerous trying to get all that data together. And sometimes, at least, you know, in some of the countries that I've reported in, the end result is not exactly what you want it to be, that you don't see the sort of serious consequences that you think should be associated with that kind of fraud. Has that been your experience? What has it been like with financial corruption reporting?
Oh, it's always like that. Yeah. The biggest example, the latest example I can think of is I did a story last year about the former Conservative Party chairman, one of their biggest donors, who was suspected of secretly funneling £500,000 from a Russian bank account directly to the Conservative Party. And you can rarely tell those stories because you can't get inside bank accounts and things like this. Yeah. But in this case, I'd managed to see a report filed by his bank to the National Crime Agency, Britain's FBI. Obviously a confidential document, you don't normally get that insight. And what it showed was that bank investigators said they had traced the money directly through, you know, the usual offshore accounts, multiple pinging backwards and forwards from one account to the other, all the way back to the account of his father-in-law in Russia, who was a pro-Kremlin politician who had a lot of business interests in Crimea. And they published his story, it created a massive fuss, it kind of went viral, it was debated in Parliament, and the Charity Commission and the National Crime Agency said they were going to review the evidence, right? The classic, we'll review, but we're not going to open an investigation. So then 2 days later, it was around 2 days later, both got back saying, we've decided, we didn't find any evidence of wrongdoing, so we're not going to open an investigation, which kind of seemed odd because, like, how can you not find evidence of wrongdoing if you haven't investigated? And privately, I spoke to some National Crime Agency officers who themselves, to be fair, were frustrated by it, but they basically said, look, the laws around money, particularly political donations in the UK, are just not strong enough for us to do anything. Yes, the lawyers basically have admitted, and we've got evidence that the money initially came from this Russian bank account. However, for us to bring a criminal case, we've got to show that the money was transferred with the intent of being a political donation. So in what world, unless you're an incredibly lucky investigator, you're going to find direct evidence showing, oh, I'm sending you this, like an email, I'm going to send you this money so you can donate it to the Tories, let me know when it comes through. Like, you're just not going to get it. So even in this case where the evidence was so strong and you had, you know, a bank that was able to follow the money, they still basically held their hands up and was like, you know, we can't do anything about it because the laws, the regulations aren't strong enough.
Do you think that diversity in a newsroom is also important when covering stories of corruption? And how do you think it sort of adds to that process?
Yeah, I think diversity in a newsroom is incredibly important. And I would start off by saying that investigative journalism, at least in the UK, has a huge diversity problem. It's one of the least diverse sectors of our industry. It's mostly white, male and posh. In every newsroom I've worked in, I've been the diverse hire. And I'm just for being a young woman, mixed race. And if I'm the most diverse hire, I think you've got a problem. And time again, it shows in the stories that they pitch. Because obviously you're going to pitch stories about corruption in particular, financial stuff in communities you have sources in, or communities where you're hearing it's having an impact, right? So if you're only publishing stories or pitching stories about corruption that are impacting your communities as a posh white man, for example, you're not going to be telling half the stories that you should be, and you're not going to be engaging all the readers you should be, and you're only really getting recourse, justice, giving a platform to a very small section of society. And I think it's really important, as journalism is such an important industry, it's such an important tool in a democracy, that we are representative of the people who live in the country, the people who read us. And I do think things are changing. Like my new team at the New York Times, we just set up a few months ago, basically, a brand new international investigations team. Before, it's always been run out of New York. And it's the first time we've done this. And on my team, there are 3 women of color, and it's the first time I've been on a team so diverse. And in a couple of weeks' time, we have our big annual summit where correspondents from all over the world come in, and we basically pitch to editors and talk about what we think the big stories will be in our countries, in our beats, and what we want to cover. And reading through the pitch list now, having such a diverse investigations team is so interesting, because suddenly these aren't just stories from Washington, from London. There are amazing stories and pitches from Sri Lanka, from India, from Hong Kong. So I think already I can see the difference it makes in having a more diverse investigations team in particular. And I think it's something our industry needs to tackle as a whole. But one other point I would say, on diversity, we hear a lot of talk, as we should, about gender, about race. But one thing we don't talk about as much is class, and that also, I think, is a huge issue. There was the latest report on diversity in the industry showed that things are improving in terms of race and gender, but the only sector where it's actually got worse is class. 80% of journalists in the UK are from professional or upper class industries. More than half went to private schools, compared to 7% of the UK population who went to private school. And I would like to see progress being made on that, as well as race and gender, because it's the whole picture we need to fix.
I completely echo that. And I think that's a challenge across newsrooms, frankly, in the world. You've been quite on the money with picking topics that have sort of led the story, whether it's Russia or whether it's COVID, King Charles. What do you think for 2023 might be the key strands to watch out for in terms of investigative journalism?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm very keen to hear other thoughts on this as well. But from my perspective, I think a big theme again is kind of money, power and ethics, because that has just been a big recurring issue for the past year. I think the sectors or the areas I think it'll be really interesting to dig into, and I'd like to see more done. One is climate. I think there's a lot of good climate reporting, but little, or I would like to see more investigative climate reporting, particularly around corruption, because I just think it's something we don't do as an industry that well at the moment. I'm sure there are exceptions around here. I also think, I'm checking my list here, I also think that politics is going to continue to be a big issue, particularly in the UK. There's a lot of talk now, obviously Labour are polling high, there's a lot of talk that they're the next government in waiting, and a lot of sources I speak to in this kind of corruption sector in Westminster say, look, when you're looking at a change of government, you've got current ministers already, trying to lobby for jobs. They're approaching companies for work. They're thinking, what's my next job going to be? Who am I going to work for? So it's a really interesting time, I think, to look at lobbying, conflicts of interest, revolving door, stuff like that. And I'm afraid to say, I think Russia is still going to be a big story. On a corruption level, a big question I'm interested in is, are the West sanctions actually working? And I think there's still a question mark over that outside all the political rhetoric. And if they are, where is going to be the new Londongrad, if you like, Dubai, Turkey, Cyprus? If they are actually working, where is Russian money flowing to if they're finally taking it out of London and the UK? So I think those are three areas I think are going to be quite big. Obviously, I think anything that kind of highlights wealth inequality is going to be really key because of the cost of living crisis, the wealth inequities we're seeing domestically, but also what COVID kind of highlighted globally. So I think anything about that, so corruption in the energy sector, the oil sector, things like that, and also finally, the NHS, I think, is going to be a big story domestically.
Rightly so.
Yeah, rightly so. And I think it's going to be a big news story without a doubt. What I'm trying to figure out in my head is what are kind of the investigative lines, are the kind of corruption, are the money stories to follow rather than, what will be widely covered as it should be about waiting lists and things like that. I'm interested if there are any money stories to cover from the NHS perspective.
Fascinating. Maybe we can broad base that and I can get John Allen in. He runs Africa Uncensored, which is also an investigative platform in Kenya. What do you think, John? What do you think might be trends and predictions for us, if you will, on investigative journalism for the year?
For the year, at least in Kenya and in different parts of Africa, predictions in terms of corruption, of course. But one of the big topics that I think we're going to be covering a lot is debt, indebtedness. There's a number of countries, a slew of countries who are now suffering the impact of very expensive borrowings and what the impact is to the citizens. Climate change is huge on the continent, not just because, possibly I think 7 out of 10 of the climate change hotspots in terms of the worst impacts are in Africa, but also, based on the kinds of discussions that happened at the last COP, there's a lot of money that's going to be flowing into Africa. We want to try and understand what this money exactly is paying for. And I think in there's possibly something investigative to look into, both from a corruption lens, but also just being able to understand it. And what people do in response to the very difficult and economic situations that are, that portend for Africa in this year. So the rise or the re-emergence of different kinds of cartels and organized crime, transnational crime, especially as relates to the cost of living, goods, services, etc. And things like human trafficking. I think finally it's governments trying to reestablish or establish control of their citizens in a very different age. There are a number of elections for very important countries. So Nigeria, for instance, and a few others across the country that are going to be very important to watch. And like in Kenya, we have a saying: all of our leaders are in the same WhatsApp. So if something happens, if something happens in Kenya or somewhere else, they're just going to copy and paste and forward to the main. So they often learn from each other in these different ways. So that's kind of broadly what we're doing.
Thank you for that. Gustavo, you run Ideal Reporters in Peru. Would you agree? Because it seems more and more that the focus will be on governments and institutions rather than individual level investigative pieces.
Well, first of all, I don't think that futurology and journalism go together very well.
Okay.
But I will talk about issues that are current, and I would bet that they will continue to be current soon. So those issues that in Latin America will remain extremely important in no particular order. organized crime, which is huge, gigantic in Latin America, and has lots of different phases and variations. From, let's say, the Sinaloa cartel to the Mara Salvatrucha to the Comando Vermelho in Brazil. Tremendous differences, tremendous impact on the life of Latin America as a whole. Environmental and extractive activities put together, which is a huge aspect and will continue to grow, and is under investigated and should be much better known. Regime instability. Through Latin America, we thought that it belonged to the past, not anymore. And we have to take into account the ascendancy of the radical right, various shades in Latin America, together with the precarious victories of the left in Brazil, Colombia, and Chile, and with other unstable regimes, such as in my own country. And so we will have a lot of stories regarding that. Major corruption together with repression. Not in every country, but in several countries. Going from old-fashioned, ruthless dictatorial repression, such in Nicaragua today, to more cryptocurrency repression, such as the case of Bukele in El Salvador, and of course, Venezuela, with some examples. Migration together with human rights tragedies. We have a human river constantly flowing, mostly towards the north, but also a lot, especially from Venezuela, everywhere. There are all kinds of stories that have come together with this kind of anguish, migration because of extreme situations of which you know is quite a bit in Europe. And the other thing is that quite a bit of the most challenging human investigative reporting, human rights, will be carried out from the exile. So let's say Carlos Eduardo Chamorro from a Confidencial will, from Nicaragua, will write from exile. Carlos Dada from El Faro will also write from exile about Bukele. And Joseph Polisuk and Eva Schatzenberger from Armando Info and others will also write from different parts of exile about Venezuela. And yet, with all the tremendous challenges that imposes, I am sure that they will be extraordinary investigative reporting. So we will have lots of stories in Latin America, lots of stories, tremendous difficulties. You will see probably Australian journalists such as Marcela Turati in Mexico continued her dogged pursuit of the disappeared, far more than in all the dirty wars in Argentina and all of that, in Mexico and all of that, risking everything every day, and they will continue to bring results.
Thank you for that. I think that's incredibly well put, even though it's so scary. Corruption layered with repression, which is probably what most countries and many continents indeed are looking at today. I'm going to pivot to some questions now. I wish this font size was a bit larger for my old eyes, but I will give it a shot. Hi, Jane, thanks for the insight. I wanted to know what you would have for an early career journalist looking at getting into investigative journalism.
That's a good question. Honestly, I give the advice time and time again, but it's just stories are your currency. Even if you're a brand new journalist and you don't have the years of experience that others might have, you can find stories that others aren't telling, even if you don't have experience. And for me, getting into investigative journalism, that's why I started out. I was a news journalist. I didn't have a special investigative beat, but on my evenings, on my weekends, I would try and find my own stories and I would pitch them. And then they say, if you get to pitch them, you get to work on them. So it was kind of a way to kind of build a CV that was more investigative, despite only working on news. And that makes you stand out because you're not only just doing the day job, filing what you expected to file, but you're making yourself stand out by bringing something extra to the newsroom. So I would just say, find original stories as best you can, and don't be afraid to go right up to editors and pitch them. They're always impressed by someone who takes the initiative to go out and find a piece of original investigative journalism.
That sounds great. Maybe before I go to these questions, I should pivot to Chris and get some of his thoughts in on the conversation.
I'm just full of questions. I'm a huge fan of your stories, and I think the piece is not really a corruption story directly, but your piece about I know the piece you did on racial bias in the criminal justice system and the joint enterprise cases. I talked to a number of UK journalists after that came out and said, how come the New York Times is writing this story about racial bias in the UK and you're not covering it? And they said, oh, we already covered the joint enterprise thing a few months ago. Of course, we didn't do the race angle. We did it about white defendants. But so maybe we had a blind spot about that. So I'm wondering about those blind spots. That is, you've talked about your role in exposing corruption. And you've talked about the relationship between playing, not deliberately, but accidentally playing on popular interests in your audience and the intersection with your issues. But are you also thinking about your role as a sort of corrective in journalism itself, that is looking for stories that were misfired or missed an issue you cared about? And so you're coming back sometimes to stories with a different lens that you're trying to play a corrective role?
That's a really interesting question. I don't know if I see it completely as corrective, but I definitely see it. I mean, the benefit of working for the New York Times, right? I mean, we're a big beast and no one's going to say we're an underdog, but we are an outsider in the UK. We don't rely on the same access. We don't think about things the same way. And often when we look at stories like the joint enterprise story, we're trying to do it in a different way, from a different angle than the British press has done. Sometimes it might be to correct maybe a stereotype or a sensationalist kind of angle that they often use. But more often than not, it's trying to dive deeper and take a more systemic look. Like there's a lot of, even on the COVID stuff, right? Going back to that, there was a lot of good news reporting about kind of individual dodgy companies winning these contracts. But when I pitched the story, it was because no one had taken a systemic look at the time at kind of the awarding of these contracts and the corruption and all of that. So it's a combination of kind of trying to just look at it from a more global perspective. And I know I work for Americans, so by global, they just mean America generally, but we are changing that inside the New York Times. We'll compare it to kind of other countries. Okay, why is the UK, to be honest, when COVID was happening, handling it so badly? Why is the death rate so much higher? What's going on? And that was kind of our big question. And because we have these correspondents all over the world that we're very lucky to be able to pull on their insights on, we can maybe question the perceived wisdom or kind of see something from an outside perspective. And in that racial justice piece, actually, series, sorry, I think the biggest example of maybe the corrective element you were speaking of didn't come from me. It came from my very talented colleague Salam, who is American but originally from Ethiopia and is not British at all. Hasn't spent in the UK a couple of years, but she had a very different take on. There's been a big scandal, I'm sure if you live in the UK, you've heard about county lines drug dealing. Huge issue. Is recruiting a lot of young teenagers from across the world to basically deal across the UK, sorry, to deal drugs across different counties. It's a real issue, it's a real problem. But what she looked at was how the authorities were using this legislation to perhaps go after, you know, mid-ranking or junior drug dealers who themselves were victims actually, but have been treated as perpetrators. And, you know, if they don't cooperate with the police, suddenly, oh, you're not going to be a victim, we're going to prosecute you for being like a kingpin. And that was the most contentious and got the biggest backlash actually, because the British media have for years, rightly, you know, reported on it in a very black and white perspective, as it just being a problem in the police or doing a great job and not questioning the use of the new law brought in to tackle it.
It was a great series. Great series.
Thank you. I pissed off some people, but that's not
maybe we can take a question from the audience now. Manar, why don't you tell us where you're from? Manar is one of our Reuters fellows and she has a question.
I'm a journalist from Jordan. I worked a little bit on investigation, but it was kind of hard in development countries. My question is, how can a journalist have the balance working on an investigation that exposes corruption without exposing themselves to danger?
That's a really good question. I wonder if it's better suited to.
I think it's probably going to
Go
go to all three
around.
of you.
Yeah, I'm just trying to cut so I'm not talking too much. Okay, I'll talk about from a UK perspective, but I do want to caveat that in, when I hear journalists like you guys talk about the work you do, I'm like, I'm not doing real dangerous work. Like, it's very different reporting and investigating corruption somewhere like the UK. Yes, it exists, but I'm not being threatened by governments or the police. So I have an easy job compared to a lot of journalists across the world. I would say, in my experience, when I'm reporting on corruption, particularly if it's organized crime or if you're talking about anything to do with the intelligence services, there are kind of multiple steps we take to keep ourselves safe. So the Russia assassinations investigation is the big example I have. So that we were talking about Russian organized criminals, and we were talking about the intelligence services in the US, the UK, and Russia. So we were like a big mark for being targeted, and we had my editor had someone in a blacked out vehicle parked outside her house for 3 weeks, just watching her. Her neighbors would tell her when to end up. A colleague of mine was followed from a meeting. I started having very weird hacks on my personal email address coming from Russia or Ukraine, IP addresses. So the steps we took, getting back to your question, was first kind of on an electronic technical perspective. We would only talk on Signal, an encrypted messaging app, and have disappearing messages turned on. For anything super sensitive, we used called a burner laptop. So this really old, like beat up laptop, which couldn't connect to the Wi-Fi and hadn't been connected to any Wi-Fi. And we would store the key documents on that. Whenever we would go for source meetings, we all added each other onto a tracking app, or which you can just get on your iPhone. I think we used Find My Phone even, so we could keep track and have an agreement. If you didn't check in half an hour, you'd check in with them. Someone would check in with them to see how they're getting on. And we got trained in kind of anti-surveillance tactics by former MI6 officers, former coppers, so we could basically keep ourselves safe and make sure we weren't being followed. So those were kind of the key steps we took, which I think are relevant in lots of different stories. But like I say, I'm sure there are others more qualified to talk about this.
Well, all of that, and also considering that I work for an independent media house, kind of have to think about the legal implications of the kind of stories that we do. One lawsuit could shut you down. So costing what actually it will take to get your story is lawyered properly. Second thing is, of course, your personal security, doing the kind of risk assessments that you need to ensure that you're not being followed, etc. But especially in the context of smaller independent media, but also broadly speaking for countries like ours, even for people who are in legacy media, it's important to think about which kinds of collaborations that you can have with different organizations that perhaps work in safety, work in advocacy, also other media houses to amplify the kind of story that you're doing, so that kind of public safety, that most times works. But on the off chance that it doesn't, then you have to have a very clear plan about how you're going to be able to evacuate, where you're going to, how long, and hopefully not have to, but it does come to that.
I'm going to quickly summarize for our online audience, because I think the audio isn't that clear. So essentially what John indicated was your personal safety, first and foremost, knowing that you have a safe place, allying and reaching out to organizations that can support. And of course, as he said, lawyering your story properly, ensuring that the legal implications don't put you down. Gustavo.
Yeah. First of all, investigative journalism in corrupt countries, I think everyone, but especially in corrupt countries, is inherently dangerous. Everybody who says the opposite is lying. And you should take that into account. And I think that most journalists, before undertaking investigative journalism, should be very clear with themselves that it might end bad. It might end in a bad way, and one has to be prepared. That being said, once you cross the river and begin doing that, there are many things that you have to to give a lot of thinking and activity to safety matters. And they range from physical safety. In the organization I founded, for instance, self-defense classes, training is compulsory, not optional, all the way to cybersecurity and how to avoid being followed and how to detect when you are being tracked and followed and all of that. And especially in today's environment, everything related with communication, safety with communication. You all know about how the technology for wiretapping has evolved. So you need to be very conscious about that. In taking all of that into account, and especially for small non-profit publications such as ours, I think that perhaps we're going to talk further about it, that networking has been decisive. For instance, all the training we have taken in cybersecurity has been brought by colleagues in our network. The servers where we have our publication, they are in Scandinavia, and that's among many other things that you do. We can access also legal support in cases that we would confront major lawsuits and all that. And as John Allen said, in practical terms, especially when you undertake dangerous subjects, you should have very well planned, and you should have all kinds of contingency planning for almost everything that might be, and use common sense and act with strategic audacity and with a lot of tactical caution.
Can I just pick up one point on
Please.
that? I think there are kind of two types of protection we've been talking about, obviously personal protection, colleagues protection, but also really important is source protection, particularly if you're contacting potential sources in countries with autocratic regimes and things like that. So when I'm contacting sources who, they might lose their job, their pet health, their personal safety might be at risk, I'm always very careful how I make that initial reach out. If it's on LinkedIn, go with like a very broad approach that's not gonna, and also message lots of other people, so it kind of just looks like a generic approach, and it's not going to get them in too much heat or let on that they said anything. Obviously use encrypted messages and disappearing messages, maybe meet in person, and also you have to protect the sources from themselves sometimes. Like I've had stories where I've taken out all these steps to anonymize someone, and then we tweet the story and they get involved with an argument with someone in the tweets underneath it, or they're like, oh, you can trust Jerry, mention my name, and then they've mentioned their name to Jerry, and Jerry's ended up being a mole for the person we're investigating and has gone straight back to PR. So I think you have a duty to kind of also go really far in protecting your sources, but being straight with them about what you can and can't do. Like often sources will ask me, oh, will you, can you guarantee that you will pay for a lawyer if I get personally sued? Or can you guarantee no one will find out my identity? And I'm always very honest to say, I can't guarantee either of those things. I can promise you I will not reveal your identity in the article. These are the steps we're taking. And legally, I mean, most cases, particularly a legacy or the New York Times, I'm protected. They tend to go for the organization itself if you're going to sue, and sometimes they might sue sources. It's very rare, and a legacy org may step in, but generally they don't do it that way. They tend to come for the org, but you can't guarantee you're going to give them legal representation if they are sued. So I think you've got a duty to be straight about the risks as well as what you can and can't do.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, Gustavo.
Short additional thing is this: if you are going to do really strong, in-depth investigative reporting that will expose powerful people, organizations, you can almost bet that you will be subject to disinformation campaigns of discredit. And quite often, in many cases, the intensity of those campaigns foretells some physical attempt. That was the case, for instance, of Daphne Caruana of the island of Man. Before the act of her assassination, she was subject to a wither discrediting campaign. So information goes both ways. And regardless of the fact that investigative reporting has grown enormously in terms of its efficacy, disinformation also has grown, I would say, even more in a comparative.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. And I would just add, as a journalist from India, it's extremely important to build a community, something that Reuters tries to do. A lot of the smaller, scrappier organizations in India are the only ones doing investigative work now. And it's often not even the journalist community that stands up and supports you. So it's important to build an international community, be part of international investigative pieces, such as Pegasus, for example, where you are adding credence to your work and gaining some support so that when you are in trouble, there are voices that stand up and support you. This is an anonymous question. I might add, we're going to go with questions for about 10 minutes break for coffee, and then we're coming back and having an off the record session. So there's a lot more we can discuss. This is an anonymous question, but I think it's important. How do you keep morale up faced with unsympathetic editors, fatigue of working on distressing topics, and potentially not having the readership you wanted? It's been written with feeling.
Love it.
John, would you like to have a go first?
Yeah, sure. I think, and this might be taken, different by journalists. But I have a very good friend of mine who's a sounding board oftentimes for kinds of stories. And he asked me a very simple but important question. He asked me, how many times do you go home and sit down and watch an investigative documentary? Is it every day? Is it twice a day? Is it 3 times a day? And for a person who's hyper interested in that kind of content, probably twice a week. And then now he asked me, of course, the obvious question, which is, how do you think the public's going to react to your content? Because we deal with such very serious, heavy topics, it's not easy for people to constantly be engaged and be at the coalface, just like, right? And so you shouldn't have, I think you should start to abandon that expectation that people are going to like your work simply because you put a lot of effort into it, simply because you think that it's interesting, or because it is interesting. The way, not just algorithms, but the world works is that many times the labor that you invest so much time in is to create this kind of library of institutional memory of the kind of work that you're doing, so that, as with the Russia investigation, people can return to that and say that there's actually been quite a bit of work and to build this body of knowledge. So on that, in terms of the public, I'd say that's how to do it. With unsympathetic editors, it's really now the converse, which is just persistence.
Yeah.
Like you need to constantly be at them and ensure that they never forget you, at the very least. And at the worst, dread picking up your call.
Here I am again.
That's kind of just like what being a journalist is. Your job isn't to be liked. Your job isn't to be, isn't to be the guy in the room who, like, the expression, if you want everybody to like you, sell ice cream, right? So that's not your job. Your job is to get the content out. And part of that sometimes might mean being necessarily unpleasant to people who are constantly being roadblocks, especially when it comes to work that isn't.
Gustavo, where would you rate yourself on the sympathy chart as an editor?
I'm sympathetic editor.
Yeah.
One of the good things of becoming old is the fact that you become the editor. So and so I completely agree with John Allen. As an editor, you don't have to be Mr. Sympathy. Not at all. As an editor, you must be demanding, but at the same time, you must be protective. And this is what I learned from the journalists whose memories I cherish the most. You should learn, you should teach to practice. You shouldn't preach, you should show. And then, of course, you should be very demanding when editing, but letting all opportunities for the journalists to grow. One of the things I have to say that still I find a little bit difficult to reconcile with the many generations that came after me, especially the last ones, is the fact that when I began journalism, a lot of the committed journalists were great readers. They read a lot. They were secret writers, if not overt writers. And so they had a lot of knowledge. It is difficult now to find journalists who read books. And of course, I am not talking about Instagram, all of that. Reading books, reading literature. To me, it is one of the things I continue preaching. I think one expresses herself himself much better the more you have read. And this is the one thing. I don't know how sympathetic I am with that.
Jane, it's a fair question, though. I mean, because many of these stories actually die either at the editor's door or by the decision that the organization may have based on their commercial interests. How do you take that on?
I've been lucky enough never had to have a story killed because of commercial interests. I mean, I worked at BBC, BuzzFeed before I came to New York Times, and I've never had that. But I did have, when I was first starting out as an investigative journalist, and before you've got more of a reputation or more of a track record, it can be harder to get editors to take you seriously or believe that you can kind of land a big story or have the skills to. So I did kind of as what John just suggested. I just kept banging on doors about not this story, but what about this story? What about this story? Until they finally give you a chance and can see that, okay, you can land these stories as well. But I also learned an important lesson for any young journalists here is when I first started out, I would always pitch ideas too soon and too big. So the more experienced journalists would say to me, manage editors' expectations. So don't go in and be like, I've got this huge story and it's going to be it's going to take down the government. Be like, go to them once you've got the FOI back rather than you've got an idea to file an FOI, for example. And kind of just be like, I've got this and maybe I could get that. But this is a base level we're starting at. Because then they trust you. And if you're kind of cautious and don't overblow the pitch as a journalist, I think they trust your journalism more and that you'll deliver rather than if you go over there, I did all when I was 21 and wide-eyed and overselling and overpromising. Now I'll be the one going, no, we can't do that, but I'll try. And I think find a mentor if you're able to. So when I was first starting out and I didn't really know how to pitch, was getting a lot of editors kind of closing doors in my face, just saying you're too young or you need to get your basic news experience for when you do investigations. I would always find my friend in the newsroom who really liked investigations and would take the time to, as you were saying, show and not just tell, and would help me. I'd talk through pictures and they'd be like, that's interesting, that's less interesting. And we'd work on pictures together, or they'd be like, okay, have you thought about what voices you'd get and things like that. So basically I'd be going in there with a stronger pitch, which is more likely to be commissioned. And if you have someone who can be that sounding board, who's more experienced, who will champion you or your work, I think having that ally can really help if possible. And if you're not getting anywhere, I got to this point, the BBC is a great organization, but when I was there, Panorama in particular, it was just very cautious. We had a new editor who came from a less investigative background, more of a newsy guy, and just wasn't that interested in the big risky investigations. I think the BBC was getting a lot of heat at the moment with the license fee, and they just wanted to do kind of more featurey stuff. And I was like, these aren't the stories I want to do. And also I'm not going to wait 10 years so I can direct my own films and tell my own stories. I'm going to leave. So also just having the guts to be like, okay, it's time to go elsewhere, get some more experience. And if I want to, I can come back, but I'm just not getting to do the stories I want to do here.
All solid advice. We're winding down on this part of the conversation. So please join me in thanking Jane for this fantastic chat today. Thank you, John and Gustavo, for weighing in as well. Quick coffee break and then we gather back, and Chris and I will moderate the second part of the conversation, which will be perhaps even more free-flowing than this one. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.